All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, in the wake of the WHO's whitewash report on the origins of coronavirus, a lot of questions have come to light that I actually want to highlight for all of you, which reveal both the corruption within our media, but worse, a possible cover-up of culpability, not only by the Chinese Communist Party, but even U.S. government officials here at home. The key point I want to make at the top is this: no evidence indicates the coronavirus was intentionally released by anyone, but the hypothesis of entertaining an accident is absolutely not ruled out. It is well known that Wuhan, the center of the coronavirus outbreak, was home to an institute known as the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which studied bat coronaviruses, and it conducted a type of research known as gain-of-function research. This research is known to be risky, so much so that U.S. federal spending dollars towards it were suspended back in 2014, before a process was put into place that reviewed new grants toward this type of research, known as Potential Pandemic Pathogens Control and Oversight Framework. That review board's job was to look at whether grants made by the National Institute of Health were worth the risk in studying dangerous pathogens, like SARS-like viruses, which emanate from bats, that are worth the risk, and to make sure that places which do this type of research have proper protocols in place. Okay, so you're with me. Well, this is where things get really crazy. We know that a group called EcoHealth Alliance received major grants from the National Institute of Health. We also know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology's specific research into bat coronaviruses was partially funded by EcoHealth Alliance with dollars that originate right here in the United States of America, in our National Institute of Health. You see now why this is so complicated. This type of research wasn't just being done by the Chinese. It was funded by the USA, because everybody wanted the results of this research. New information that has increasingly come to light casts light on what could be a tremendous U.S. government screw-up. My old colleagues at the Daily Caller reported recently that the National Institute of Health openly acknowledges now that the grant it made to EcoHealth Alliance for gain-of-function research in Wuhan was never scrutinized by the review board that was put into place to make sure this type of research was being done safely. That has prompted calls now by some Republicans to investigate why this oversight never happened, especially given that one of the most vocal and visible people in America as a result of this pandemic has been Dr. Fauci, who literally heads the NIH and could bear some responsibility, at least in terms of negligence, for allowing any of this to happen. The more I have spent time gathering the facts on this story and more, I have been agog at the intersecting parts. One hand, you have the media, which, because they hate Trump, decided from the beginning to say that the lab leak theory was not only debunked, but that it would incite violence against Asian Americans. The Chinese government, of course, would never in a million years implicate itself in an accidental leak of one of the most deadly viruses in modern memory. And the scientific community has been awfully silent on this. Now, I assume that the silence was because they didn't want to be tarred as racist by the New York Times or called conspiracy theorists. But now I've actually come to understand that the National Institutes of Health's involvement here implicates one of the largest scientific granting institutions in the country. So people don't want to run afoul of the NIH, who it seems now is not only connected to the type of research which may have spawned this pandemic, but it didn't follow procedures in place to make sure that a lab leak specifically did not happen. And I'll end with the most troubling part of all of this. It brings really everything full circle. You'll remember the group called EcoHealth Alliance, which facilitated the funding between the Wuhan lab and the NIH. Well, the president of that organization, his name is Peter Daszak. And guess what? He's literally the only American member of the WHO's investigation into the origins of coronavirus, which conveniently ruled out a lab leak. As to why he believes the Chinese when they say that it didn't come from a lab, here's what he had to say to 60 Minutes.
We met with them, we said, do you audit the lab? And they said, annually. Did you audit it after the outbreak? Yes. Was anything found? No. Do you test your staff? Yes.
But you're just taking their word for it.
Well, what else can we do? There's a limit to what you can do, and we went right up to that limit. We asked them tough questions. They weren't vetted in advance, and the answers they gave we found to be believable, correct, and convincing.
So they said they didn't happen, therefore it didn't happen. We believe it. Again, the conflict of interest here is crazy. This is the man who facilitated the funding for this type of research, joining the investigation into whether that funding caused one of the worst economic and health events in the last century. You think maybe he doesn't have a vested interest in concluding nothing came from that lab, that the virus was natural, and therefore the millions of dollars that the U.S. has granted EcoHealth Alliance over the years is all good? I choose to focus on this story today because I want to highlight again, this isn't partisan. It's not anti-China. If it did come from a lab, it looks like the U.S. government was just as complicit as the Chinese in terms of not following the standards. And the point is that the truth should will out. And it's not that the reasons why it's not is because we have a media that really is refusing to do its job here. We have a government that may have been involved. And we have our massive geopolitical rival with an incentive to make sure nobody ever learns the truth. And if you hated the last year as much as I did, then you probably want to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again. And to do that, we need an actual open and honest inquiry into the origins of coronavirus, and sadly, it is simply not something that we have seen yet. Crystal, I wanted to do this because people seem to look at the lab leak theory as some sort of like coded anti-China thing. And for many GOP members, that is what they are doing.
Yeah.
But look at the involvement here, or possible and alleged involvement, I should say, of the NIH, of major granting dollars. Now we have an American organization, nonprofit, EcoHealth Alliance, where the guy who was funneling the money for this type of research is the investigator into whether the research caused this thing in the first place. It goes back to what Dr. Brett Weinstein was talking about here in terms of the reluctance to go into this wasn't just media and Trump. The farther you deep, it's because there are millions of dollars at stake in terms of granting. And as always, I should have followed the ethos of the show. Follow the money.
Follow the money.
Yeah.
You know, it actually, that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, is realizing the incentives that the scientific community had in this whole thing as well. Because it's not just the NIH's sort of involvement here. It's also the fact that this research is very exciting. Scientists get a lot of grants to do this kind of
money.
So the very people who are involved in this research and benefit from the funding of it are the ones that are doing the investigation, the ones who are doing the analysis to say, hey, nothing to see here. And look, I don't want to say that they're intentionally covering it up.
Yeah.
But oftentimes when your livelihood is threatened or at stake, you can convince yourself of a lot of things that are to the benefit of, that happen to be to the benefit of your career. It's the same incentives that we see in the media where it may not be so blatant as like, I am going to make sure that I screw over Bernie Sanders. But you know where your incentives are, both within the organization, you know who your contacts are, you know where your bread is buttered. And so you conveniently come up with reasons to have your coverage towards him slanted and negative. Now, sometimes it really, it actually is that blatant of like, I'm going to screw this person or I'm going to cover this thing up. I don't want to go as far as to allege that here, but anytime you have a news story, this is really how you have to read it. And this is kind of a perfect illustrative example. You have to think about the incentives of everyone involved in the story. The incentives of the writer and the outlet, the incentives of if the government has a particular line that they're towing, like why are they saying that? What's their vested interest here? The incentive of the experts that are quoted, everyone involved. And because I'm just not like deeply entrenched in the scientific community, this one wasn't totally obvious to me at first that the scientific community themselves had a vested stake in what the results of this investigation ultimately were.
And that's part of the other problem. We fetishize science over the last, look, obviously, vaccines are awesome. You know, mRNA technology is incredible.
Yeah, but these are just human beings subject to the same incentives and everything.
All communities are subject to the same incentives that all other communities are as well. And we cover structural problems in the media, structural problems in our politics. It would, you know, can assume that the same things will apply here to the scientific community. And we've seen Jamie Metzel, he's a scientist, he's been leading the way on this. Open letter that recently talked about tainted politics within the WHO report. And increasingly, it does look like any actual inquiry into the gain-of-function research and a lab leak would implicate the NIH and our own government oversight into this research as much as the Chinese scientists. And I am for everybody who was involved being exposed here. I don't care if they're U.S. or Chinese. And I am beginning to understand now even more so why some of this information is being so hurriedly, not just, like we said, not intentionally covered up, but overlooked, brushed aside. Everybody wants to move on.
Right.
I want to move on too. That being said, we need to know what happened here.
Anytime there's this just like sudden societal decision, like, oh, we can't even talk about that. Like, you're crazy. If you're a conspiracy theorist, if you talk about that, where it comes down super hard and without legitimate justification, you should ask some questions.
Bingo. All right. Looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.